After Bhagawan took away my services, after Rameshwar shut down and defunded the Fate Project and evicted me and my wife from the LA Temple apartments, I wound up moving to BV, the Bhaktivedanta Village in Three Rivers, California. I was there until the summer of 1987. Sulochan was murdered in LA in May of 1986. I wasn't living at the LA Temple at the time, and somehow I was isolated enough from it that I didn't even hear about a devotee being murdered until months later when I came to LA for the LA Rath Yatra. And even then, I only heard it was a devotee who wasn't from the LA Temple, but it was someone from New Vrindavan. So at the time, I didn't even know that it was my old friend Sulochan. And when I did find out many years ago, I was in disbelief that such a sincere and loving disciple of Srila Prabhupada had been so cruelly murdered in cold blood. As I've just explained, in 1986, Sulochan completed his book exposing the dark side of the current ISKCON Guru system, that especially the zonal acharyas. He also gave some preliminary evidence that Srila Prabhupada never appointed these men as gurus. But unlike my conclusion, where I say that it was due to a misunderstanding and mistakes on the side of the GBC, Sulochan concluded that the GBC had conspired to lie to us. He proposed that the GBC knew that Srila Prabhupada did not want the 11 men he had selected as Rtvik representatives to become regular gurus, and that the GBC purposefully chose to disobey Srila Prabhupada and push this idea, even though they knew it wasn't what he wanted. Anyway, I totally disagree with those conclusions. And the evidence that I will be presenting in the chronological timeline will back this up. But the reason he had jumped to such conclusions is understandable when we look at all the circumstances. First of all, the GBC had tried to keep the July 9th letter hidden from us. They only told us that Srila Prabhupada had written a list giving the names of the 11 men who they said Srila Prabhupada wanted them to be regular gurus. When Sulochan read this list, it was actually a letter that was supposed to have been mailed out to all the temples, but it never was. And then he saw that in this letter, Srila Prabhupada had only authorized the 11 men to act as his, Srila Prabhupada's, Rtvik representatives, and that there was no mention at all of them ever becoming gurus. And when so many of these gurus were falling down, and Sulochan was hearing what appeared to be credible allegations against Kirtanananda regarding his involvement in the murder of several devotees and molestation of children. There was the very high priest, LSD priest, Jayatirtha, who had been caught having LSD-fueled sex romps with his female disciples. Hamsadutta had gone ballistic in the machine gun guru. Children were being molested in the Gurukulas. Prabhupada's disciples were being kicked out. Young women were being pimped to raise funds for their temples. Tamal Krishna wasn't without incident. He had his own fall downs. In 1980, he was suspended as a guru by the GBC for his offensive preaching ideas. Rameshwar, Bhagawan, Harikesh, they had become impossible tyrants over their zones. Jayapataka, Hirananda were also not without controversy. Jayapataka, there were thug-like disciples of Jayapataka who infamously would physically attack any Prabhupada disciple who dared say that Jayapataka wasn't a pure devotee. And anyway, there were so many things going on. It was a very dark and ugly period for ISKCON. And many of us were just trying to keep our heads above water and just survive. All of these things taken together painted a very bad picture, and especially the fact that the GBC had kept the July 9th letter hidden from us. For years, even as many of the original 11 new acharyas were falling down left and right in major ways, still the GBC continued to insist that these men were pure devotees. And they continued to prop them up and artificially insist they were fully qualified and bona fide gurus. Any devotee who dared suggest otherwise was shown the door and unceremoniously kicked out of ISKCON. All of this combined led devotees like Sulochan, who were among the first to get access to the July 9th letter, to assume the worst. And that was that the GBC knew Srila Prabhupada had never wanted those men to become guru, and that the GBC this whole thing had been a lie perpetuated by the GBC. It was hard not to make that assumption under the situation. At that time, Sulochan was hearing from reliable sources from New Vrindavan about the dark behavior of Kirtanananda, and so many other gurus were falling down. So in the midst of all this, Sulochan projected a lot of Kirtanananda's underhanded dealings on all the other gurus. Many of Srila Prabhupada's disciples were already convinced that there was no way that Srila Prabhupada could have lacked the insight of knowing that these men were not qualified to become actual gurus. So a small but slowly growing number of devotees who finally got access to the July 9th letter and saw that Srila Prabhupada had only authorized and selected these men to act as his Rtvik representatives, and that there was no mention at all of them ever becoming actual gurus. Slowly, a consensus among them was it's just a few devotees at first, that Srila Prabhupada never asked them to become gurus, and that the GBC was totally wrong about this. Either way, they were either wrong because they made the wrong decision, or they were and mistaken in their understanding, or they were corrupt and wanted to become gurus so badly themselves that they were just lying to us. This all began mostly in thanks to the ultimate sacrifice that Sulochan made, as he made copies of these letters, the July 9th letter included, and began circulating them. So as devotees tried to make intellectual challenges to the GBC's position on this issue, the GBC took extremely harsh retaliatory action against them by having them excommunicated from ISKCON. Even advanced senior devotees, temple presidents, etc., their services were taken away and basically booted out of Prabhupada's mission for simply questioning the GBC on this issue. This simply poured more fuel on the suspicion that the whole GBC was corrupt and lying to us, because many of these devotees who were being kicked out were very sincere disciples of Srila Prabhupada. At least there was enough suspicion that led Sulochan and the early supporters of the Rtvik RAS system to reach the conclusion that the GBC were all lying to us. And this became somewhat the predominant mood by many of the early adopters of the Rtvik RAS path. They would openly call out the new gurus as being fallen cheaters, of being liars, of being totally corrupt, just like Kirtanananda. And this is not the conclusion that I have reached. But in the mid to late 1980s, when the Rtvik RAS idea began to take root, many of those who supported it were bitter toward the zonal acharyas for all that they were doing in their madness, and the GBC, because many of them were just wrongly kicking out devotees, Prabhupada disciples, like Rameshwara and Bhagawan had tried to do with me. Many of them had their services and positions in ISKCON taken away. So those early Rtvik RAS supporters portrayed the gurus as being evil and having knowingly conspired against Prabhupada. And as I said, I do not support that conclusion at all, and nor does the evidence support it. But what I'm trying to do here, however, is just paint the picture of how all of this came about and the mood at that time. Both sides, the GBC and the newly forming Rtvik RAS supporters, began attacking each other. The GBC taking harsh actions of kicking such devotees out, and the Rtvik RAS supporters by attacking the characters of the new gurus. And the result of this was that rather than members of the GBC or the gurus wanting to sit down and discuss this issue in an intellectual way, their action was to defend themselves from what they saw was clearly an attack against them. They felt obliged to defend the system that they had set up, and to defend the path they had taken, and to defend the decisions that the GBC had made in 1977 and 78. They had assumed that in 1977 and 78 that the path that the GBC had taken was the path that Srila Prabhupada wanted them to take. And so they were convinced that they were defending what Srila Prabhupada wanted for ISKCON. Thus, they saw that the Rtvik RAS idea was just a poisonous, deviant philosophy that was only born out of enviousness, and whose supporters were fallen and bitter devotees who were overcome by that envious nature. In contrast to Sulochan's conclusion, I have reached the conclusion that the GBC in 1977 and then 78 had simply were mistaken in their understandings of what Srila Prabhupada actually wanted. And the evidence that will be presented in the chronological timeline section will prove this. I keep going off into somewhat, of these details, but I wanted to paint the picture of what the circumstances were and how all of this got started, and why it took so many years for the Rtvik RAS path to come out, because we didn't have access to that July 9th letter. And I keep referring to that July 9th letter because it is important, because even for the zonal, the GBC Guru system, that's the letter that Prabhupada wrote the names for those 11 men who became the first gurus. Anyway, now back to my story. In around 1986 or so, needs to be noted that in 1985, the North American temple presidents had met and pressured the GBC to start reeling in the gurus and to dismantle the zonal acharya system. It didn't really get started until 1986 or after, but in 1985, the temple presidents, the North American temple presidents, had met and were requesting the GBC to do this. It took them some time because the zonal acharya, and they were all quite powerful within their zones, and it took some time.